So just to set the stage briefly, so we will have, and I'll let the panelists introduce themselves quickly, but we'll have a few case examples that we'll put up. The objective will not be to explore each one in detail, but as we go through the questions, just as a point of reference, if you want to say, well, I would handle this differently than that, that's where we're trying to basically get with the case examples. But we'll get ready to jump right in, but I want to give the panelists the chance to introduce themselves, and we'll get started. Jim?
I'm Dr. Jim Cross. I used to work for Aetna, was the Vice President of National Medical Policy and Operations for Aetna, responsible for clinical and reimbursement policy. And now I'm semi-retired and doing some consulting work.
John.
Hi, I'm John Goldenring. I am a physician, academician, medical director, and also a fully licensed lawyer. So I see from every direction, but I have to give a disclaimer, which is that I'm speaking for myself today and not for any company that I'm associated with.
And I'm Rick Powell, and I would echo that to begin with. I'm the Chief Medical Officer at a thing called MedPoint, and we are a fairly California-specific entity. We're a management services organization representing about 1 million lives, sort of interspersed between the health plans themselves and the physician groups, delegated by the plans to perform most plan functions. And again, probably 1 million Californians, a mixed bag of Medi-Cal, as well as commercial and senior lives. So we're kind of seeing every side of the picture.
For those of you who don't know, we call Medicaid in California Medi-Cal.
Medi-Cal. One of the many things that we slightly change in California.
Hello, I'm Keith Tully. I'm from the UK, so it's a pleasure to be here in San Diego. It's the first time I've been to this meeting. I'm a health economist. I run Tully Health Economics. It's a consultancy, which is a health economics consultancy, but I also have a role as a contract with one of our health technology assessment bodies in the UK. It's the smaller one, the Scottish Medicines Consortium, represents Scotland, but like the other panelists here have said, I'm not going to be representing their views. These are my views that I'll be talking about.
Thank you. Thank you. Just one quick slide to set the stage in terms of some of the core value challenges associated with this entire area. One is what is it? What are we really talking about? There are many platforms, many types of technologies. These things are truly novel. We haven't seen many of them before. We're starting to see many more of them, and obviously there are 800 to 900 therapies en route to market. What couple of factors distinguish this area? It either has to last longer or work better or both in regenerative medicine, so we're in for the long haul. Proving prolonged duration of therapeutic effect is really key. There's a lot of uncertainty that comes with that long sort of value demonstration cascade. We'll explore that a little bit in our discussion today. Not every therapy, but some therapies are single administration models, and that creates its own attendant set of problems in terms of payment for these therapies, and there's no real market in the world that's fully built for very expensive single administration therapies. And the matrix is not really built that way for these therapies. We didn't envision these therapies when the system was set up, and there are all sorts of bits and bobs that we'll explore today in terms of how do we navigate technologies through a system that wasn't really built for these therapies. Just to quickly set the stage, we have 3 disease area examples: hemophilia A, critical limb ischemia, and non-small cell lung cancer. I won't go through all the details here, but all are very severe. There are key outcomes. These are big deals from a cost perspective. Billions of dollars U.S. cost, for example, for many of them. And we have some of this information. I can click back to any of the details, like what's a rough cost range of an amputation in the critical limb ischemia area. But we'll just use these as sounding boards. And I'll keep the next slide up for the majority of the session so that we can refer to it. We can click back to the other one, just let me know. But we have hypothetical treatment acts with some actual outcomes that we can make comments on as we go. And I won't go through this before or in detail, but we'll jump right in with some of the questions. So with these three hypothetical areas in mind, and this can be a general question. The first question, so basically what I would like this panel to do is kind of walk through the technology assessment, the reimbursement, and the payment, because there's a great session tomorrow morning that Michael mentioned. We're going to spend a little bit less time on the HTA part of this, the value assessment piece, and more time on the reimbursement payment issues, other bigger picture adoption of these technologies into our systems issues. So the first question that I would like to ask is, at the point one of these therapies shows up for technology assessment for evaluation, in what ways might you or might you not look at these technologies differently than other things? How will you view a regenerative or advanced therapy that could have a very profound magnitude of therapeutic effect? It could be transformative. In some cases, it could potentially be curative. Are we set up to evaluate a therapy that may have a curative outcome and then has a prolonged duration of therapeutic effect? So you have chicken and the egg issues in terms of how much evidence you can come to market with versus the longer term value proposition, which is how long does this stuff last and show us. And we'd just like to start, and we can kind of initially go down the line. We can start with you, Keith, and go backwards and start with more of the European perspective, and then we'll walk back just some quick thoughts on how the system is or is not prepared, or how it's beginning to think about these therapies.
Well, from a UK, and maybe this is relevant for quite a few sort of European countries as well, we have national or regional health technology assessment bodies. In the UK, we've got the body NICE, National Institute for Clinical Excellence, covers England. My body that I work with, Scottish Medicines Consortium, covers Scotland, doing a similar thing, evaluating the clinical and cost effectiveness of new treatments that come to market, that are launched and come to market and have got their license. They've gone through the regulatory phases, so they're efficacious and safe enough. So we have these national bodies, and they have, in the UK, we have a certain value framework that we apply, and it is focused around clinical and cost effectiveness and demonstrating that. And so all therapies go through this, or all new therapies go through this. The main how would they handle something like a regenerative medicine any differently? Currently, if any of these, say, three that we have examples of came to a body like NICE, no differently, to be honest. No differently. There are systems in place already. So there would be, so a haemophilia, to be honest, haemophilia doesn't, it's a special case in a bit of the UK, chosen an interesting example there, haemophilia. It has special ring-funded funding for haemophilia products anyway. But if that was to go, it would be dealt with in the same way as treatments for heart failure, for diabetes, for any other sort of new treatment that comes along. Wouldn't be treated differently. The same framework would apply. And the same for the product for the autologous cell therapy product. Again, the same process apply. And a CAR-T gene-modified cell therapy, they also would go through the same process. There are special approaches. So we already deal with cancer products in a little different way. We give them extra weighting because they improve life at the end of life. If it's a very rare condition, and none of these are rare enough, as it were, if it's ultra rare, prevalence of less than 1 in 50,000, and very high unmet need, other criteria, special considerations might apply to those to allow for the lack of relatively low level of data and robustness of that data, and also the special sort of circumstances of very rare diseases. But the first initial response is, currently, the three examples we got here would fit into the current processes that are in place. There wouldn't be anything special at this moment in time.
Any quick comment you want to make about the uncertainty issue? There was the mock assessment, which has been discussed with this membership in the past, but any thinking about the uncertainty issues associated with the long-term?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a critical issue in any new therapy. Cancer therapies have that great uncertainty. What's important to a body like NICE? They're spending public funds, as it were, or they're making decisions based on public funds, is that how does the patient impact? How does this therapy impact on the patient? And that's often in, for cancer therapies, overall survival. You have trials of 12 months, 18 months, and so forth, and you're extrapolating a long way beyond that to a lifetime horizon. There's a high degree of uncertainty. It's part of the key consideration that they take into account. If the data is immature, if it's not got overall survival endpoints, then it's based on surrogates, then there's a high level of uncertainty, and that's taken into account when making reimbursement decisions or guidance decisions on this. If there's too much uncertainty, they may well not recommend it.
Thank you. So Rick, from your perspective, what does this look like for an organization that's working between the providers and the plans?
We're kind of in an interesting position because as far as approvals and coverage issues, on many of these things, we defer to the plans themselves who are providing our funding. And Medicare has their own areas of coverage. The Medicaid plan, in this case California, Medi-Cal, has some issues of coverage. There are vast areas, though, where there are no specific issues elucidated. So we rely on the plans individually. They have some areas where they specify coverage criteria. And then there are other areas where it's kind of left to us. And so you're sort of pecking through a hierarchy of, well, what's the best guidance that I can get on this? Yeah. And there are, to complicate the matter further, as you mentioned in the case of the hemophilia, there are carved out issues where there are certain areas that we know, or that we knew at least initially, were going to be higher cost, specialty areas. So some of those are carved out. It used to be kidney transplants, for example, things like that. There were separate funding streams for those. So it's a complicated sort of hodgepodge of funding.
Just a quick comment on that. So looking at the hypothetical price range that we have here, $250,000 to $750,000, and in some cases, with just very few of the European launches, that it's hitting on the upper bracket or beyond. Any sort of thoughts on how the system may handle, carve downs, what provisions may be put in place if categorically many of these things fall into that upper bracket or in this range?
The two examples that I would draw on from recent experience are the hepatitis therapies, which were, by these standards, small change at $100,000, but when they launched were sufficient to bankrupt a couple of the smaller health plans here in the state of California. Literally out of business, gone. And that's $100,000, not $1 million. So that's sobering. Yeah. The other area,
curative.
Pardon?
Let's not forget that
it's
was
curative.
Right. Yes. So it's an interesting thing.
Yeah.
And the other issue about curative, I was going to save this for a little bit later on, but as well, is the mobility of the managed care patients. Yeah. That there's always second thought given to a high upfront expenditure for a given patient when that patient moves frequently. So that's always in the back of the mind of a lot of the funding agencies as well. Sure. Is you lose track of the patients, they fall off the grid, then they come back again. But the other area I was going to pull attention to was the treatment now of the transgender patients. Yes. And that apparently had always been a benefit, but it really wasn't known until the last year or two. And that's an extraordinarily expensive, very complicated set of therapeutic requirements. Relative lack of expertise, real challenge in aligning the care of those patients. And that's been a thing where some of the health plans have stepped up and taken the entire burden. Others have just done the delaying tactic of not making a policy, and so nothing's getting done, so all you wind up then are generating grievances. And then there's middle ground. So it's a really interesting time to be going through all of this.
Okay, thank you. John?
Well, let's start by saying that every one of the health plans in the United States has a technology assessment program. They either buy it from someone or they have it in-house. Yes. And we're going to treat each and every one of these things the same way. We go through the same process. It's very similar to what our colleagues do in the UK in terms of the science. We look at the science. That's what and we say we do that, and we mean it. But then comes a curative treatment for hepatitis C, 90% effective. What did we do? Well, Senator Everett Dirksen once remarked, $1 billion here, $1 billion there. Pretty soon you're talking real money. That's what happened. And for the first time in my career, we rationed the care.
Yeah.
Period. From a public health point of view, hepatitis C is bad news. You get a curative treatment, you give it to everybody. Period. We did not. We made up all kinds of creative ways to limit the amount of spending, and it's still bankrupt every single Medicaid program in the entire United States. So just because something's curative doesn't solve our problem. Here, for example, with hemophilia, for example, with gene therapy, if we had a gene therapy that worked, and I'm going to talk about that in about 30 seconds, we would save enough money in 3 years that we could pay for it. So it's an easy case, right? That's an easy case. Because we always lose money on hemophilia. We know that. All right? But what we get back is productive citizens, which you can pay for, and we can't. But we're still going to make our money back in 3 years, so we're fine with it. But there's a lot of other therapies where that ain't going to happen. And the more prevalent the condition, the less we're really getting anything back in an offsetting cost. And that brings me to whether it works or not. And in fact, for example, here, let's just take hemophilia. If you have a gene therapy for that, the first question I ask you is, what's the take rate? How long does it last for? What am I getting? Well, with hemophilia, it's probably easy because you don't need a hell of a lot of factor not to bleed. So it probably has a good take rate. But there's a lot of other issues where I consult on these gene therapies, and nobody can tell me what they really think the take rate is. How often am I going to have to repeat it? Well, not at my cost, at your cost, and so forth. It's a very key question because in the end, this stuff's really expensive. And pretty soon, when we put all these therapies for orphan diseases of all kinds together, you're talking real money. Real money. Who pays for it? Well, we don't have a health system in the United States, but I guarantee that who pays for it is all of you.
Well, I would make sure that we separate the clinical coverage policies and the tech assessments that occur from the reimbursement policies. I mean, I really think there are two sides of the coin. So, at least in my experience, when I was at Aetna, one of the larger health insurers in the United States, and United and Prudential and other companies that I have worked for, I don't speak for them, obviously, but in a large payer at least, the technology assessment was its own division of the company. It was run by the clinicians. They looked at the clinical evidence, and they looked at the necessary approvals, whether it's FDA or whatever, and they made the decisions off the clinical published peer-reviewed literature. So I don't think that changes at all in terms of technology assessment with these new technologies. I think that, as was mentioned, there's probably a little bit more give for things that are life-threatening or serious illnesses. Typically, for example, with cancer or other life-threatening illnesses, there isn't the same opportunity to have 10-year outcomes or 12-year outcomes. By the time you do a study for 10 years and really know what happens, all the drugs have changed in the interim. So the study is almost irrelevant by the time you're trying to assess what the real impact might be. And to complicate things even more is the off-label use of these drugs, which gets even more complicated and an additional burden to look at the literature to see if you can make some sense and make good scientific decisions around whether something is covered or not. With these therapies, obviously because they are so expensive, they're certainly going to get a lot of attention, but I think most of the different attention that they're going to get is around the reimbursement side, not around the technology assessment component. I think the technology assessment infrastructure that exists in most payers, whether they do it themselves or buy it or have a combination of the two, is going to be the same process. For FDA approval on drugs, that's pretty much a done deal because the requirements of the FDA for drugs is strict enough so that we can just pretty much bless what the FDA approves for those labeled indications. For other FDA approvals, like for devices or other treatments that are not under the drug process, if they're 510K or some other process, the payer is going to look to the literature and additional clinical information to try to make the decision. And the FDA will get them through the door, but it's not going to be enough. So I think that's the clinical part. The technology assessment, I'm pretty comfortable, is going to be the way the technology assessment is. On the reimbursement side, I think there's two big challenges with these new technologies. The fact that they may just be one and done, and $1 million a pop. And because they're like that, we typically don't have a good reimbursement model today. Now, the good side is that in the last 4 or 5 years, we've changed our contracting approaches to value-based contracting, shared risk, outcome-based reimbursements, all kinds of discussions with providers of care, with payers, about how can we work together, how can we share in what's going on, how can we both come out winners in this environment. 6 years ago, it was all about sitting around the table and arguing about price. Today, it's not like that. So this industry has the advantage, I think, and the positive side of this is that at least the industry is talking in terms of these kinds of reimbursement changes. Yeah. Whereas 5 years ago, you would have been not only in the forefront of this kind of technology, you'd been in the forefront of that kind of contracting strategy and reimbursement strategy as well. So the advantage to you, I think, is at least that groundwork is on its way. Mm-hmm. It doesn't necessarily always address everything that this is going to challenge you for, but at least it's not starting from scratch. The real disadvantage of this technology from a reimbursement perspective is what was mentioned earlier, and that is who has the patient for how long. If it's a one-time $1 million hit, and you only have the patient in a fully insured environment, on average, 18 months, how do you make the economics work? If you're CMS, once you get the patient, you've got them till they die. So it may be easier for a CMS population to support this kind of therapy and understand that they're going to make a long-term economic equation work. For fully insured business, where it's the payer's money and it's governed by the states, individual states, all the filings have to take place, and they only can afford, in certain instances, to have much less rich benefits because of the fact that they don't keep the patient. And for the self-insured market in commercial business, for example, 75% of most of the major insurers are self-insured. They're just the administrator, and the dollars are from the employer. Now it's a matter of what kind of employer are you? Are you an employer that keeps your employees for most of their lifetime, and it might well be worth investing in them? Or are you a company that has a high turnover and your staff change on a regular basis, yearly, 18 months, whatever? So I think it's a very complex environment from a reimbursement perspective. I think the industry can handle the technology assessment. I don't think that's going to change that much. But I really think that the reimbursement challenges are going to be new and different and bigger.
Yeah, and my perspective, so understanding that the assessment process will largely be the same, but what I always caution is that the scrutiny factor on these therapies, because they're novel, because there's the perception that they will be very costly, is you can't leave anything to chance. You have to come to market, even with a rare disease, with a very strong, solid, well thought out value proposition. Where you get into challenging issues is the duration of therapeutic effect issue. How many years worth of data can you come to market with? And they may cover that tomorrow a bit in the workshop. How do you deal with that uncertainty of this works for a long time, years, or for a lifetime, and show it versus what you have as your package when you come to market? But I would like to...
But that's not that different from oncology. I mean, I think oncology is a very similar environment where you usually only get 2 years of data, and then you have to suppose that 2 year of data is going to be sufficient. There's a lot of pressure from any payer around cancer therapy because it is life-threatening, that they be more liberal, I'll call it, and be more responsive to what data there is. And you don't have the luxury of waiting.
And that's, in the UK, the way we deal with that is something called the Cancer Drugs Fund, which, if there's potential for cost effectiveness, but the evidence is too limited, immature to fully decide, there's too much uncertainty, then it's funded in an interim period. It's really coverage with evidence development, but you have to get the evidence, collect the evidence, and prove the benefit at the end. And I can see regenerative medicines could potentially move into that frame if they are seen as important enough. It's okay outside of cancer as well, you know.
But commercial payers don't have that option because their benefits don't allow for it.
No, in the UK.
But CMS can do it. CMS has a lot more innovative opportunity just because it's their thing.
Well, this is the kind of thing that's expensive enough that eventually there needs to be a discussion about whether this is appropriate for health plans. Yeah. Or whether we really need to nationalize this kind of thing. And I really need to say that because I think there needs to be a serious discussion in this country of what things insurance companies can appropriately pay for. Because one of the things I always get asked is how are we going to pay for this, and you know, can you pay for it over 5 years? And I'm going, excuse me, violates the Cider House rules. I'm not a bank.
Well, a good example is the federal government did take long-term kidney care away, right? So the payer is responsible for whatever months it is, and then the government takes over, right?
And that's
so that was, I mean, that's just sort of an odd example, I suppose, but it's an example where there's sort of a social responsibility, a societal responsibility to cover these individuals, like whether they're rare diseases or the population is too small, all of those issues.
Or the fact that we can't pay for indirect costs,
it's not
but the government can. The government gets to do that because they get productive citizens who pay taxes.
And we'll spend the rest of our time in general talking about these reimbursement dimensions. There are a couple of levels. One thing is that systematically, the reimbursement system wasn't often set up for these therapies. So if it's inpatient, I have yet to see a DRG that was ever built to accommodate the cost of most of these therapies. Regenerative medicine's a broad swath. There's a lot of stuff in there. It's not all therapies in this price range, which is something to keep in mind in general, but many of the therapies just simply don't fit in the reimbursement system easily. And then you get into the payment issues if it is something that's high cost. How do you see the systems reacting to the first few of these? And I want to make sure that we take on board a European perspective as well as a U.S. perspective.
Well, look, almost every contract today, I would guess, in the U.S. With a hospital facility has a clause in it that says if it's new and experimental and not part of the existing agreement, it's a carve-out. So almost every one of these really expensive technologies, whether it's an implant or it's a cell therapy or whatever it is, if it's a lot of money and it's brand new, it's almost always carved out and it's billed separately and for the most part not under the contract.
But do we need to define what that is? So is it only the curative therapies, of which we have no idea what percentage, or is it transformative? How do you define it?
Doesn't matter in that
doesn't
sense.
Matter.
But it does matter in this sense. For example, if I'm going to do this, say for hemophilia, let's use it as an example, I'm going to want to have a certain number of centers of excellence, I think, where where we're going to do this, because this is not something where I want to have to repeat it.
Yeah.
And y'all aren't going to want that either, because I'm going to have something in the contract that says if it doesn't work, you're doing the repeat on your money, not mine. We need a performance guarantee. And so we're all going to be in the same boat on that one, because when it costs enough, there has to be that contractual discussion about what's reasonable and who's going to really pay for this. Because in the end, like I said, there ain't no such thing as a free lunch, and y'all are paying, one way or another.
Yeah, but I think the deal is that once something is approved from a technology perspective, clinically proven, right, then there's coverage. I think that's when all the tricks of the trade sort of come into play. How do you contract? Do you have centers of excellence? Do you have authorization? Do you have step therapies? Do you have formularies? All the things that managed care does start coming into play as to how do you want to deal with this new thing that costs XYZ and is done in a certain fashion. I think that once it's approved and it has coverage, then it's the challenge of the payer and the providers to come to some form of agreement as to how this is going to be handled.
Rick.
And that's going to change. We're in an environment right now where there's a lot of cost shifting from the groups, from the plans back to the groups, from the government to the plans, et cetera, and even from the groups to their physicians. And in this era where all of a sudden values become the watchword and there's a tremendous amount of time, attention, and technology being devoted to assessments of value, and with the idea of putting the providers in a position where they have skin in the game. Mm-hmm. You all, as providers of new technologies, will have someone different to whom you have to promote your product, because it's going to be up to not only us approving it, but the oncologist or rheumatologist or whatever ologist on the ground deciding that it's worth his investment, because what we're seeing is more and more their bonuses, their remuneration period are being tied to their cost effectiveness. We saw this in very early baby steps with the move toward generic drugs. And every month or every quarter, we get a nastygram that tells us what percentage of prescriptions we've written have been for generics. And it's not only for those areas in which generics exist, it's global. And so people make their treatment, their therapeutic decisions to some degree, at least somewhere in their mind, based on that. And now when you're going to have these sort of expenses put into the picture, it'll be interesting to see how that impacts the provider's decision making.
Keith, a more societal perspective, you may be thinking, well, all this sounds like complete chaos. How will...
That's because it is.
Well, it does sound interesting, because I mean, in the UK we divorce the value for money argument is done by the HTA bodies. So let's say they're really looking at value for money and cost effectiveness as well as clinical effectiveness. And let's say each of these three products were past that test.
Yep.
Maybe with a bit of a discount on the, usually a discount or a deal on the price, shall we say, which lowers the price. However, what happens is it's the payer. They're not the payers. The payers, the reimbursers, is the National Health Service. And this would all be National Health Service England, it's called, for England, for example. And they have to cope with, how do we actually pay for this? How do we afford this? And that's going to be where there's the affordability question comes in. All of these would probably go through new regenerative medicines that have curative or large transformative benefit will be subject to specialised national commissioning. It won't leave it to the individual regional payers, of which we got 200 and something. Sure. It won't leave it to them to decide this. This would be national. This is special enough to be national specialised commissioning. So it's NHS England, and NHS England influence is nice. Nice works for them. They will be very scared. NHS England are really scared about budget impacts. And I think this is around a lot of the European payers,
sure.
Spain and Italy and elsewhere, really scared about budget impacts. And this big cost up front, unless it's a very rare disease, or it's cancer where they've got a special fund, any of the other ones.
It's non-small cell lung cancer that has a much more, a much larger patient population than what you're seeing in hemophilia A. Then you get swing back more towards the Hep C sort of scenarios. It's not that prevalent, but
we had Hep C.
As volume increases, then...
Yeah, so the answer to Hep C was, one, NICE restricted the populations to certain genotypes, and then there was a deal done to spread the cost over time, because there's no way that it could pay upfront. Payers hate upfront costs. They have the incentive to delay costs. Yes. They want to pay later, not now. So this is totally against the grain, and the pressure is even more in England. It's come in. Budget impact didn't come in that much before. Now it's coming in from NHS England. And they're going to be very, very frightened with some of the regenerative medicines, especially with larger numbers, about this upfront cost. And a deal will have to be done. There's no way it will get reimbursed unless there's some spreading out of the payment, maybe even into a performance-based, or pay you if you continue to maintain the curative benefit, as it were.
There's another aspect about hepatitis C that was interesting. You know, it was essentially a curative therapy, right? And it cost about $100,000, and we paid for it.
Yeah, well,
when I was at Aetna, we paid for it. The issue at Aetna, and maybe with other companies, was how aggressively are we going to promote screening for it? Because the more we promoted screening for it, the more patients we'd find, and the more payout we'd have to pay. So it wasn't that we didn't cover it. It wasn't that we didn't pay for it. The issue was how aggressive did we really want to take care of the population? So from a societal, medical perspective, I mean, I put my doctor hat on and said, we need to do this. I didn't win.
Yeah, well, but that's because in the end, that's what I think we're all saying in slightly different ways, is that just because you got a cure doesn't mean we'll analyze that scientifically and we'll come to the conclusion that yes, your treatment is 90% effective. So, and it ought to be covered, but then the question is under what circumstances and who's going to pay. And you know what we did with the Hep C, for example, here in the state of California, for example, we said, sir, you have a bad disease in your liver, and we have a cure for it, but hang out for a few years until your liver gets worse, and then we'll pay for it. That's exactly what we said. And we could get away with that because it probably wouldn't kill them over that next 2 to 3 years. But that's a horrible way to approach public health. It didn't have anything to do with preventing transmission, didn't have anything to do with screening, as you pointed out, et cetera, et cetera. It was merely a budgetary consideration, which trumped, because if there's no money, somebody's got to come up with it.
So if we take the oncology example here that we have, and this thing slides across your desk tomorrow, what do you do with it? How does the system react to it? And it has pretty good, for all intents and purposes, if you're familiar with the lung cancer statistics, a 3A patient has a 14% 5-year survival rate. Doesn't look so good. So this data would be very compelling in general. You have 6-month overall survival, 75%. So you've really transformed care with this therapy. If the therapy costs $500,000, how do you handle it? What if it were $1 million? How do you handle this therapy when it hits and it's a single administration? This is a gene-modified cell therapy. What happens? What things happen within the system?
In the current model, if something meets the clinical criteria, like you said, the data is strong, it's likely going to get clinical approval and covered, then the question is, how do you pay for it, or how do you put it in the equation? You have to remember that most payers already know that there's going to be new technology every year. So it's not like a surprise to them that there's new technology. They build into all their projections, all their premiums, all their everything, a certain percentage of increased medical cost because of technology. For it to be on the radar for the finance people or the actuaries, of the 1,000 policies that we reviewed every year, maybe a half dozen actually rose to the level of a finance guy saying we probably need to look at that and we may or may not need to adjust what we're projecting or what we're doing. And the other challenge is that the clinical approval happens on this date. It takes you a year or two to build any premium changes or any revenue flow changes because of that technology. So they always, again, have to predict what's going to happen. And in their predictions, they build a certain amount of this cost in there.
But there's a point where that becomes very difficult. And that is when you start having more and more therapies that are very expensive for rare and orphan diseases, et cetera. at some point, as I said with Senator Dirksen's quote, you know, it starts to add up. And when it adds up enough, somebody's got to pay for it, and the premiums have to go up if we want to have these therapies available. And that's where I said, y'all are paying.
Yeah, but I don't think just increased premium is going to be the ultimate answer. I think that goes back to our earlier discussion about we really have to have a different conversation about these technologies.
Yeah, so does these have to be nationalized? But in the end, then you pay for it too because your taxes go up.
So this is the perfect segue to ask the question.
Right.
If you guys were the architects of a system that would work and be able to absorb these technologies, in addition to the rare disease technologies we already see coming to market, the precision technologies, in precision medicine, as you slice down to smaller subpopulations, the cost has to go up and other stuff. But if you were the architects, what do we need to change? What do we need to do to make this
You're basically looking at, as you were saying, as we were just saying, sort of a Medicare equivalent where you're able to spread the cost. That's the problem they ran into with Obamacare to the degree that you've got to get enough healthy people bearing some portion of the cost to be able to cover those folks who actually need the therapy. So you got to be able to spread this over a far greater number of shoulders.
Right, so nationalizing it. So the first law of insurance is what? Thou shalt distribute the risk.
And be predictable.
Yeah, and if you don't do that, then it doesn't work. Ask the British East India Company. I mean, this goes back forever. And that's why Obamacare failed, or is failing. And that's why, in the end, if we don't come up with some way to distribute this sort of nationally, I think, then we are going to have considerable problems with raising your premiums or the premiums of our self-insured.
Well, I think we have to be careful about saying that Obamacare failed, because I think that, you know, that was a 10-year plan, and if you would have let it play out the way it was supposed to play out, where enough people would have been required to enter the system, and the penalties would have been there to keep them in the system, and the spread of the cost would have been where it was supposed to be. That would have been good. And if the Medicaid expansion would have happened, that would have been good. And it's now to the point where the subsidies have to be in there. Because the other piece was, if you had sicker people, you got additional payment so that you could manage a level set premium with the additional subsidies. And if, in fact, you were a managed care company that actually could manage those patients better than if they didn't have insurance, which you should be able to do, then that was your opportunity to make money. So it's sort of odd, but the one thing that in the exchanges or in an Obamacare environment, you actually wanted sicker patients because you wanted to keep them, you wanted to do better with them, and you would make more money because you had the subsidies. If they take away the subsidies, then everybody's back into this flat playing field that nobody can win. Right. So that's why if you want it to fall or fail, you take away the subsidies.
So, Keith, you already are in a societal model. You already have the risk pool. So what does it look like from the UK side? Then we'll circle back to what the issues with the risk pool in the U.S. commercial market.
You see, we don't have the luxury of raising premiums or anything like that. It's a tax-based system, 90%.
And you can't manufacture more pie.
You can't just raise taxes. It just doesn't happen. So,
right. But you can raise taxes.
People resist that completely, even though you say, well, do you want to fund your healthcare more? But you're not willing to pay more taxes to fund it. So you're left with a certain pot of money, and you have to distribute that. Now, I can see that if the new regenerative medicines came along and they were, I think, for a segment of, and it would never fall on my desk to say, oh, really expensive payment. This would be sorted out before that at a national commissioning level. A deal would be made with the company. But I could see potentially a fund, a bit like haemophilia fund is funded separately if it's important enough.
Oncology fund.
And like we have an oncology fund, a regenerative medicines fund. But it won't be for every regenerative medicine. I don't think, it will be those with real curative potential. We have to see, does society value cure? And I think it would, but does it value enough that we can then... The thing is, we base it on a very equitable system. If you take it from one pot, you're going to be and put it into a fund, you're going to be taking it from somewhere else. So, you know, that's going to be the battle, is where you're going to take this money from. Which patients are going to lose out?
Right. So from a health technology assessment standpoint, the definitions of transformative and curative don't really matter that much. From a payment standpoint, from a reimbursement standpoint, they're absolutely critical, because anytime, so you could look at it, do you define it as regenerative and advanced therapies? Is that what you call the pool? Then you can define and limit. If you call it something like curative therapies, then it opens the door to everything that falls into that bucket.
Absolutely.
So how do we deal with the what do we call it, how do we define an issue? If it's transformative, that opens the aperture even wider.
It does.
Because there will be a very small potential, but we don't know what the percentage of curative therapies may or may not be. Transformative can meet any definition. It's a sliding scale.
I think they'd be very scared of that transformative, you know, and it's curative they could focus on, you know. It's like the Hep C example. It's almost curative, potentially, I think. And there might be some other from the therapies that are like that. But transformative, say if it wasn't haemophilia, but 50% reduction in bleeding.
Yeah.
Well, we need to start having the discussions about this and the education of the public about it, because we've got a lot of things on the public's plate. If you have a house and you don't maintain it, it falls apart. Well, guess what? We haven't been maintaining our house. And so we have a lot of infrastructure expenses that we have to deal with. We have insane people who fire out of windows in Las Vegas at concerts. We've got to figure out how to deal with all the insanity that comes with security. We have climate change, which is very real, that we're going to have to deal with. And then we got all this healthcare expense, and I'm just starting to talk about all the things that are on the national plate. We need to have a serious discussion of what our priorities are.
So, Rick,
how do say one quick thing? Yeah. That if we only carve out the curative portion of this, that doesn't solve our problem, because probably the vast majority of these are not going to be curative. They may very well be transformative, and they're certainly very expensive. So we're still left with that where we started.
How do you look at the relative? So I understand planned churn, but taking that off the table, how do you look at the prolonged duration of therapeutic effect issues relative to the cost of standard of care? Because if you take something and you're able to either not treat or have minimal treatment of patients that were costly anyway, right. How do we assess that? Because there is value there. How do we bridge the gap?
Well, one of the models is this whole ACO model, right? Where it's an agreement between the payer and the provider that they are going to agree to pick the right care, the quality care, give them the cost-effective care, and that in the end, the equation will be that there's medical cost savings and that they'll share in those savings. Yeah. If you have that kind of agreement more and more happening, then the transformative stuff fits in, assuming, again, that patient sticks with that ACO long enough so that the payer and the ACO can get the longer-term medical savings.
We know they don't.
Outside of a risk pool, is there any way to deal with the portability issue?
Only making it a larger global entity where, regardless of which plan they change a month, it's still part of the larger entity.
Right, and that's the issue. And that's why I'm saying that we need to have a discussion about what things really need to be paid nationally in this country. Because I think in the UK they can make some rational decisions because they've got a system where they can figure out what society's getting back, how many colleagues they're getting back, and so forth.
But I can't think of anything today where the actual financial responsibility follows the patient.
What about like chronic kidney disease or something like that?
Well, you gave the example of kidney disease where it became nationalized, essentially.
Yeah. But other than that, the minute they move to somebody else has got the financial responsibility.
There is no other real one, although we have some strange things in how we pay for hemophilia that have to in the hemophilia meds. But in the end, that's the key thing, is how do we distribute the risk so we don't violate the first law of insurance and make this something that we can get to people who have rare eye diseases, who have hemophilia.
But right now, this is going to be a onesie, twosie response. Yeah. It's going to be onesie, twosie, it's going to be payer by payer, it's going to be technology by technology, and it's not going to be pretty. And I think that what it really calls for is is this whole collaboration between government, private, payers, providers, and to come to some rationalization about how we approach this. That's a big haul, a big lift, because to get government and the other entities to actually collaborate and come up with a solution that the politicians can live with is a real challenge right now.
Eric, I think one of the other areas, another fork in the road we haven't come to, and we may not have enough time yet, is the presence of a good enough therapy. Do you have a viable alternative that may be...
So what about hemophilia, where we have factor and other products?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking for haemophilia, we use prophylaxis, and okay, prophylaxis means there's very few bleeding events.
That's correct.
So as a 50% reduction, we're not too interested if it's prophylaxis.
But in this case, it might pay for itself over time, which is why
it might pay because there's inconvenience. And,
this is the easy example because over 3 or 4 years you might make your money back.
Right. Yeah.
There's a lot of harder ones out there with rare diseases that are now being worked on for gene therapy, where you're talking about things like allowing people to live through their life with decent vision. Yeah? Well, that's great. And I want that as a doctor for my patients. But we as a society have to figure out how we're going to pay for it.
At the risk of slowing the momentum down, we have about 7 minutes left. I want to open it up to the audience to see if there are any super piercing questions that you have that I can defer to the panelists.
Or any answers.
Or any answers.
We'll take any answers that y'all have. Just throw them out there. Yeah.
Hi there, just have a quick question. When you mention some of the existing value-based models like accountable care organizations, which I agree because the providers assuming risk might be a good model, but when you consider that the benchmarks become more stringent over time, the longer that someone's in an ACO, or as they evolve into a more risk-based ACO model like Track 2 or Next Gen, how do you address this from a quality perspective? Because I think the financial benchmarks will become too challenging for this universe, but the quality side is what I don't hear much conversation about in terms of how does regenerative medicine fit in this paradigm, and how can we change the existing quality metric space to reflect curative, transformative therapies so they can work in the existing paradigms of bundle payment models, ACOs, and so forth.
Well, I think all of the ACO reimbursements and arrangements are all sort of still in their infancy. They're all different. There's the federal approach and how those work with Medicare, but there's also all the commercial deals that are ACO-like arrangements, and again, they're all different, and I think they're all challenging in the sense of coming up what the agreement is of what are the goals, what are the end stages of how the reimbursement sharing or risk sharing takes place. Some of them are only upside arrangements. Some of them are true risk arrangements where they're positive and negative. I mean, you name it, there's an ACO type of arrangement out there. So I think, again, it's a whole area that I think needs to evolve more. But I'll go back to my original point, which is at least we're talking like that. At least we're having those kinds of contracting conversations that are not resolved yet. There's not a standard really yet. There's not anybody that's really happy with everything about them, but at least it's moving us in the direction away from the old way of doing contracting, which was just to fight over a price.
High quality care should be cost effective care. But what we have as a difficulty, which our colleagues in the UK, for example, have less of a difficulty on, is that a lot of the savings that come back are indirect costs. And that's something that we as health plans in the United States do not reap in any way a benefit for. We do not pay for indirect costs. And so, whether it's Alzheimer's disease or anything else down the line that we could talk about for hours, that's a big problem for our American non-system of healthcare.
Other questions?
I love this thing.
We've got people. Yeah,
hi, good afternoon. My question is more centered around piggybacking off of what you talked about with the reimbursement on the cash flow part of this. Because the manufacturer, especially the small and emerging manufacturer, wants their payment up front. They don't want to wait 5 years to be paid for this over time. Larger manufacturers can probably absorb it just like they can eat the price as well. Who do you see stepping in that void? Because the payers, like you said, is going to want to delay this over an annuity of some sort, especially for the pay for performance part. But you have the small emerging manufacturer,
but not too much.
Right. But small manufacturer wants to be paid yesterday, especially those that are pre-IPO or whatnot. What steps into that void? Banks are going to add too much complexity. PE is going to mark it up too much. Government's not going to get involved probably for a while. Where do you guys see that
Who's
going?
the Lloyds of London that you'd like to create? Because that's historically what happened. That's what happened historically.
The East India Company.
Yep, that's why I mentioned the East India Company. I was being deadly serious about it. This goes back a long way when you talk about how to finance frontier efforts. And we need to think about that if we're not going to have it come from our taxpayers' money.
There's always been a gap between the time that a product is getting developed and is evolving into having the kind of evidence that it needs to meet the criteria for clinical coverage. The payers, the government, they're, for the most part, not paying for that time frame between when something is developed and when it actually is ready for the evidence to be enough. So, that's a real tough nut to crack. The payers and their benefit plans and their structure today doesn't really have a way to sort of help out in that time frame. Yeah. So for the most part, the investors and everybody else that are around that company are still responsible for funding whatever it takes to get you that end point of having clinical coverage. Once they have clinical coverage, then they have the opportunity to work on the reimbursement aspect. But there's no real reimbursement discussion during that transition to getting coverage.
We have time for one more question. I see one gentleman back here with the power cube.
Great. Thanks so much for this really terrific panel. I guess it sounds like there's a lot of openness and willingness to consider new reimbursement paradigms. But if we contrast that to the lesson of hepatitis C, which is dig in your heels, kick and scream, vilify the innovator for a drug that cured hepatitis C, but I don't think most saw it as exorbitantly priced relative to that cure. And if you dig in long enough, you're going to force that price down substantially. And now the price of a hepatitis C cure is ridiculously cheap by most standards. So why isn't that the lesson that we're going to carry forward and watch implemented as this field evolves and say, oh yeah, we'd like to be good partners and stewards of innovation, but whoever comes out with the next $1 million product, we're just going to dig in and say, nope.
The reason, this is all basic economics now, the reason the hepatitis C cost is now much less is there are numerous competitors. That's what it's about. That's what Dr. Samuelson taught me. When you get a lot of competitors, the price comes down, right? And I want to ask you, how many competitors to your gene therapy are you going to have within 5 years? I doubt it.
And in the UK, the Hep C drugs are discounted. And around Europe, they're very much discounted from the list price because there is a limit to the willingness and the ability to pay, especially in tax-funded systems. So, and it's all assessed by a cost-effectiveness matrix that we have. We have set criteria for how cost-effective you can be and how much you're willing to pay for a health benefit. So even a cure, there is a limit. And
but if the drug has been out long enough, so Hep C treatment has been out long enough at the higher price that they've been able to make up a good amount of their investment.
Yep.
So they're in a position now. Yep. 2-3 years later to bring the price down.
It looks like unfortunately we're out of time, but thank you guys so much, and please join me in thanking these gentlemen for their time.